Well, hi, welcome to the Jewish Road. I'm Ron Davis, and we are picking up once again in our story of the life of Joseph. And we're studying the life of Joseph right now because, believe it or not, we're heading to Passover season, and Joseph actually has something to do, we'll see in the end, that takes us right into, at least prophetically, into Passover. So we'll look at that when we get to the end of the story. But right now, we're going to pick up the story where we left off last time. And you can remember we talked about the fact that Joseph was loved by his father more than any of his brothers. And this made his brothers quite angry. He was therefore hated by his brothers. And then Joseph had a couple of dreams, and he shared them with his brothers and then with the rest of the family. The second dream, and it says they hated him all the more, his brothers did, for that. And they said, really, are we going to bow down to you? Because he had a dream of the sun and the moon and the stars, and the family representative in that is ultimately going to bow down to him. And he had a dream of the sheaf, and their sheaves all bowed down to his sheaf, and so they hated him. And that's where we discussed last time. But now we're picking up on another section in the life of Joseph. And remember, undergirding all of this is the providence of God, God's sovereignty and God's providence in the life of Joseph. And not only is God providential in the life of Joseph, but he is providential in all of our lives who are called according to his purpose and who are following him. And so that idea of providence is going to follow us all the way through in the life of Joseph. And let me just bring us back into focus with what that actually is. A good definition of providence, as we gave last time, is it's that continued exercise of God's grace and kindness by which, in his wisdom and power, he preserves and governs and is operative in all that comes to pass in the world and directs all things to their appointed end. And that is something that has been true up to this point in the life of Joseph, and it is going to continue through his life as an important facet of God using him to bring all of the issues of his life and the determination for this entire family to their appointed end. And so now, as we find Joseph, we're going to pick up the story in chapter 37 and verse 12. And in this section, this is a section where Joseph goes to find his brothers. He is sent by his father to find his brothers. And we pick it up in verse 12. It says, "Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph," Israel is the name that God changed Jacob to Israel, "and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." Now, given all of what has taken place so far in the life of Joseph, and especially in his life, along with his brothers, you might think that this 17-year-old kid is going to say, "Hey, Dad, I don't want to go there. Those guys don't like me. I know they don't like me, and I don't think it's a good idea." And so when Jacob says to his son, "I'm going to send you to them. I want you to check things out." He doesn't say any of that at all, what we would think he might say. He says, "Okay, I'll go." and so, this is a 17-year-old boy who, in spite of everything, is going to go and find his brothers who really don't like him very much. And so it's really an amazing thing in the life of Joseph, because you see, God never spoke to Joseph like he did to Abraham, and like he did to Isaac, his grandfather, or even Jacob, his father. Um, Joseph was relying on God's word as it was handed down to him from generation to generation, and he was living by faith in that word. And so Joseph says, okay, I am going to go. I'll do what you want, Dad. So Joseph, probably had at his core there, and maybe some kind of an understanding of the providence of God. I don't know, but he said to Jacob in verse 14, he says to him, go now, or actually Jacob says to Joseph, he says, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. I want to know how everything's going with them and how everything's going with the flock. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now, I think there's something interesting here. He says, Joseph is basically saying, okay, Father, I am going to go to those who hate me, to those who don't even like me, and won't speak a word to me. I'm going to seek them out, and I'm going to see how everything is going there, but I'm going to seek them out, those who don't like me. Does that remind you of anybody? Joseph is one of the most significant types in the whole Bible, I think, of the Messiah himself. And so this is just another situation of that. And so Joseph goes in verse 15. And in verse 15, as he is in Shechem and he's looking for his brothers, it says, a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. He's looking. And the man asked him, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. He said, please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. And in verse 17, then the man said, they have moved from here. I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them in Dothan. Okay, now, I don't know what Jacob was thinking when he sent Joseph away. This is about a 50-mile trip that he's sending his 17-year-old son to go check on his brothers in Shechem. And that has to take probably at least 2 days, maybe 3 days, for him to walk that over the hilly terrain and everything else to get to Shechem to check on his brothers. And, maybe Jacob, kind of put on a back burner all the animosity that the brothers had against Joseph. And maybe he thought it really wasn't all that bad. After all, he's their brother. They're not going to do anything. And, I'll just bet that if Jacob knew, as he watched Joseph walk away and head to Shechem to check on his brothers, that he was not going to see him for 20 years. And I'll bet you that Joseph, when he walked out that day, didn't realize that he was never going to see his dad again for 20 years. And in all of this, God was providentially in control of all of these circumstances. And so Joseph is heading out to Shechem. He doesn't find his brothers there. The man says they moved on to Dothan. And so Joseph heads toward Dothan. Now, that's about another 15 miles from Shechem. So there's a total of about 65 miles that he is walking to find his brothers. And it's really an amazing picture, because when you think about it, when he gets to Dothan, some really interesting things happen to Joseph. In verse 18, it says, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. So as soon as they see Joseph coming over those hills, he's a ways away, they get together, they form a little group, and they have their powwow, and they say, we're going to put him to death. They said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Here he comes. Here comes the dreamer, the kid with the coat. And you can just see all of the animosity that is there. And they plotted to kill him. And you have to catch the irony in the story here. One thing is that if Joseph would have found them in Shechem, he probably would have died. But there's an interesting catch to this whole thing, that they moved on to Dothan, and that is where he found them. As they sit watching Joseph coming from afar, they're plotting to kill, another thing, the very person without whom they can't be saved. Ultimately, in the end, God is purposing in all of this to take him to Egypt, so that in the time of famine, which is coming, he's not going to die, and the family is not going to die in the famine. They are going to be the ones who receive the providential care of God through the life of the very one that they're trying to kill. And again, this is just so much a type of Yeshua, Jesus, the Messiah, also. So as he comes across the horizon, they're planning to kill the only one that can save them, basically. That's what we're looking at. And so, just some thoughts on this. It's kind of amazing to me. I want you to notice something that you may have already noticed here, but the answer to all of what is taking place here in the life of Joseph, and not only in Joseph, but in the life of his brothers, in the life of the whole family, is the fact that God is sovereignly in control during all of the events that are taking place here, because God is going to direct all things to their appointed end. They're going to direct all things to his appointed end. And sometimes his appointed end is different than what we think our appointed end is, or what it ought to be. But God has his control, his wisdom, his power, by which he preserves and governs, and he is operative, remember, in all that comes to pass in the world, and directs everything to their appointed end. And so this is what is taking place. Do you see in the life of Joseph so far, as we're going through this, just a glimpse of one who is going to come, who is actually far greater than Joseph, and we're talking about the Messiah. Let me explain a little, because it was on account of envy and jealousy that Joseph ended up in the cistern and faced the prospect of death. And when Pilate asked the crowd in Matthew chapter 27, do you want Barabbas or do you want Yeshua? And the crowd, the record tells us that Pilate understood that it was on account of envy that Yeshua was delivered over to him in the first place. And the religious leaders didn't like the fact that God had sovereignly purposed to unfold the reality of who he was in the person of Yeshua, of Jesus. And so Joseph, as a redeemer for the preservation of the people of God, is kind of a forerunner of that same role, and a picture of it. He's a type of it. So we have a picture of Yeshua as we find Joseph traveling across the country in search of his brothers, looking for those who are ultimately going to reject him, but looking for those who he is ultimately going to save. So we see the brothers, in response to Joseph, saying, you remember, do you think that you are going to rule over us? Do you think that we are going to bow down to you? And then comes Jesus, Yeshua, as the Good Shepherd, looking for you and looking for me. And will you respond in the same way that the brothers did? Will you respond to Jesus in the same way that they responded to Joseph? I won't have him ruling over me. Um, I don't mind giving, a little nod of approval to Jesus. I don't mind him sitting in the back seat. He's kind of an insurance policy, but I don't want to have to bow down to him. And so then if that's the case, then there's no Yeshua for you. Because the Messiah who comes, the Messiah who came, he is the one before whom we must bow down, even as the brothers will. Ultimately, as we get further into the story, they will at the feet of Joseph. And so as our minds look at all of this, don't we see that Joseph holds the answer to everything that is going to represent the deepest problems that they're going to have? And Yeshua is, in his power, he is the answer to all of our problems. Joseph was despised and rejected by those that he would one day save. And it's the same picture that we have in Isaiah chapter 53, which is a chapter that was just so significant in me coming to an understanding that this is a prophecy about the coming Messiah, and it fit Jesus to a T. And so the same thing could be said of Joseph. He was despised. He was a man of sorrow. He was acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we hated him, in verse 3 of Isaiah 53. But the thing is Isaiah isn't speaking about Joseph. He's speaking of him who took our sins, the one who took our infirmities. He was pierced through for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. By his stripes we were healed, in verses 4 and 5 of Isaiah 53. So, it's hard to look at the life of Joseph and look at the prophetic word at this point of Jesus, and knowing the fulfillment that he had when he actually came to his people Israel and offered himself as the Messiah, as the King. And I can hardly keep myself from moving forward to that scene when he's reunited with his brothers, and he is standing there. His brothers come down into Egypt, and there's Joseph, and he speaks to them actually through an interpreter. He was fluent by this time in Egyptian, but they don't recognize Joseph. Why don't they recognize Joseph? Well, he doesn't look like Joseph anymore. He doesn't have scraggly hair. He doesn't have a beard. At 17, I don't know if he would have had a beard yet or not, but maybe. And yet, as an Egyptian leader, he's standing there before his brothers, and they don't recognize him. He is for sure clean shaven, probably made up with makeup. His hair was different, maybe even had a headdress on. He looked like an Egyptian. He didn't look like Joseph, their brother, at all. And so they don't recognize him after all these years, with him dressed in all of this finery and glory that you would expect to see from the rulers in Egypt. And after all, the last time they saw him, he was, as I said, he was just 17 years old, getting thrown down a hole, and then strapped to the back of a camel and being sold off into Egypt. And I want to take a look at that section in Genesis when he finally comes to the brothers. And we pick it up in verse 18. It says, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that the fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Okay, so they've got the plot, they have the plan, and when Reuben, that's the oldest brother, heard of it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." And Reuben said that, it tells us, because he says it that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. And so that's what Reuben has in mind. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in the pit. And they just throw him down in there. It's a pretty deep pit, probably got hurt on the way down. And they sat down. After that, you know what they do? They sit down and they eat lunch. And as they are eating lunch, in verse 25, looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? What profit is there? We're not going to make any money off of that." He said, "Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother. He is our own flesh." Wow, all of a sudden, you know? And so his brothers listened to him. They listened to Judah. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So they sell him. 20 shekels of silver was the average price for a slave in those days. And he was on his way to Egypt, strapped to the back of a camel, he was screaming and yelling and pleading with them, "Don't take me away. Don't do this to me. Don't take me away from my home, from my father, from everything." And, Joseph is just pleading with them, and they just ignore him. They ignore him now. We find out later when they come down into Egypt for bread, and they run into some trouble. They say, "God is dealing with us. Didn't we hear him crying out when we sold him into Egypt?" And so that is an interesting point. But what is really an interesting point is that the fact is when Joseph was sold into Egypt, you remember where he was originally supposed to find his brothers. He was supposed to find them in Shechem. And they weren't there. They had moved on to Dothan. And I think they moved on to Dothan in the providence of God. Once again, he is arranging all of these things to bring it to his appointed end. And why did they move to Dothan? Because Dothan is on the trade route to Egypt. Isn't that amazing? So they move up to Dothan. Miraculously, I'm being a little facetious, they are on the trade route to Egypt. They spot these Midianite traders. They sell him for a few bucks, and he is off to Egypt as a slave, all in the providence of God, all in the sovereignty of God. As I said before, if he would have found them in Shechem, they probably would have killed him. He probably would have died. There would have been nobody to sell him off to, but moving to Dothan changed the whole complexion of the whole story. And so they sell him off, and now I don't know where he was, but Reuben was gone someplace. And when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is gone. It's without doubt, he is torn into pieces." And in verse 34 it says, "Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. And all of his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, 'No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning.' Thus his father wept for him." So, as far as Jacob is concerned, he lost his son, the son that he loved, the son of his beloved wife, Rachel, who he loved. And, Jacob is just torn to pieces. He says, "I'm going to go down to my grave, you know, to my son." And he is just mourning. And so his father wept over him. And the last verse in chapter 37 says, "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." And so, here we have the story finally now. Joseph, who was sent on just an innocent expedition to check on his brothers and to check on the herd, now all of a sudden is sold as a slave into Egypt, and we're not going to see him again. Well, we'll see him, but his father and his family are not going to see him again for 20 years. And they're talking while they're there in Canaan, about the poverty of their condition. And Moses, who wrote this story in Genesis, tells us that Joseph went into another room when he had met his brothers, and he wept great tears. Well, remember they said, "We will not bow down to him. We'll not come and present ourselves to him." When we pick up the story and get down the road some about the brothers finally meeting him, and Joseph meeting the brothers, and then he can't even stay in their presence. He has to go out of the room, and it says he wept. It reminds me of Yeshua, Jesus, who came to Jerusalem and wept over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stone the prophets and kill all who are sent to you. How often would I have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." He said, "Behold, your house is left to you desolate." He always referred, and he's referring to the temple, he always referred to that as his father's house. But now he says to them, "Your house is left to you desolate." Now it's your house, because you have rejected the Holy One, the one who was sent to you, the Mashiach, the Anointed One, the Messiah, the King. And so there is, again, similarities between the life of Joseph and what happens with his brothers, and the life of Jesus and what happens with his brothers, the Jewish people. And so just to, kind of conclude everything, what we have thus far in all of this, we have a coat, which this is Joseph, represents Joseph and the object of his father's love. We have a dream, which is represented with Joseph, who is the object of his brother's jealous hatred. And we have a dark well, which is Joseph, and that is he is the object of God's providential care. And, the picture of all of this is the Messiah who was to come. And so we're going to leave the story off, the life of Joseph, right there today. And we will pick it up next time with Joseph in Potiphar's house, and we'll see what happens to him then, how God is going to use him in his providence as he is bringing all things to their appointed end, and in that, the preservation of his people. Okay, so good seeing you. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, shalom.